Welcome to the Awakening series, where we seek to infuse the movement with voices, resources, and inspiration for today's challenges. I'm your host, Michael Guzman. Today, I've got the honor of being here with Karl Vaters. Karl's an author, a podcast host, a pastor, and a guest speaker at our upcoming Helping Small Churches Thrive conference. So, Karl, so glad to be able to have you here. Welcome to the Awakening series.
Great to be with you today.
Awesome. Well, hey, we usually start off at the front end of this with just a little bit of biography, whether somebody that I'm speaking to is known in our region or not known, just get into a little of their biography. So maybe give us a brief history, like ministry history. What leads you to your current post today?
Ministry over 40 years. I've been at my current church for 31 years here in Orange County, California, just a little bit south of Disneyland. And I graduated from Bible college just barely before the church growth emphasis of the 80s and 90s hit hard. So I came out having been taught like old school pastoring. Right. Like I literally used 5 or 6 of my father's textbooks from Bible college in my Bible college.
Yeah.
Right. And then within 5 years of me being out of Bible college, nobody was using even mine anymore because everything had shifted. And so I saw the shift taking place and thought, okay, I need to get up to speed. So I did. I did the work myself to get up to speed on the church growth and to new innovative ways of doing ministry, and started appreciating a whole lot about it. But as I tried to implement the church growth strategies, very few of them seemed to work for me, and none of them brought about the kind of numerical increase that they seemed to promise. To the point where I found myself at this current church, after I'd been here about 15 years, after going through a bit of a growth spurt and then having it all collapse beneath me. And there was no reason for the collapse that anybody could put their finger on. There was no scandal. Wow. There was no split. There was no reason for it. Just the whole thing fell to pieces beneath me numerically. I found myself really debating, am I called to ministry? Because I can't seem to produce the numbers that everybody else says you should be able to produce if you're doing this correctly.
Yeah.
And I ended up having to figure out, okay, what does it look like to assess healthy ministry without numbers attached to it? Because as I started to look around, I found a whole bunch of other discouraged pastors as well, who appeared to be pastoring good, healthy, strong missional churches, who also weren't producing the kind of numbers that seemed to be promised by the church growth stuff. And so I just started looking for it myself. And I actually put in my first book that I only wrote this book because I couldn't find this book.
Hey, that's good.
So I started writing about what does healthy small church ministry look like, try to encourage and to resource small church pastors. And it took off like crazy about 11 years ago. And so since then, I've been doing more and more of this and doing less and less of the pastoring. 6 years ago, actually, my youth pastor became my pastor and I became his teaching pastor.
Hey, that's awesome.
And as of January 2024, I will no longer be on staff here at this church. It'll still be my home church, but we will be doing this full time because the need is overwhelming. So now we just simply do the ministry of helping small churches thrive.
That's really cool. What a cool story. I love it. And I think it's interesting the way that in some ways it maybe intersects with mine. So I was at a church, we were full church growth model, and we're doing relatively well in it, but there seemed to be some things going wrong. I remember like coming home going, man, this machine just takes so much to keep it going. And I remember even in a sense, like, prayerfully, reflecting back on a day or a week and just thinking like, man, the show that we put on, I could hear it in my language. It's a lot to do. We're exhausted and worn out. And so interesting, we did have some real negative challenges that surfaced in the midst of it and then caused a real radical shift. And then I was leading on the other side of that, trying to do, at that point, we were really trying to be missional focused and lead and grow with multiplying disciples. And so, very interesting intersection to hear your story. And then the length of time that you got to be there, still even at the same place. It just sounds like there's a lot of health that was going on in there. So I know we're going to get to some of the small church stuff, but maybe just even out of this bio, as you look back at your own church, what are some of those hallmarks of health versus just the numeric standards that you look at and maybe celebrate or really appreciate about your local congregation?
Interesting, because when I went through this period of time where the church went up and then went down, and I actually walked away from the church for 40 days, and only because that was in the Bible and I couldn't find an 80 in the Bible, so I figured I wanted to do the biblical thing, and it's all
Yeah.
40s. Uh, but I also went to a pastoral counselor and spent some time with him. And at one point, he asked me, if it wasn't for the numbers, would you say your church is healthy? And I answered, yes, I
Mm,
would. So quickly, he
mhm,
actually sat back in his chair. He was like,
mm,
"Well, like, you're really sure about that, right?" I said, "Well, I think I'm sure, but actually, I think right now that's part of my frustration and part of my problem." He says, "Your church is healthy and that's the problem?" I said, "Well, yeah, because everybody keeps telling me all healthy things grow. And
yes.
I think the church is healthy, but it's not getting bigger. So I must be missing something. Like for the first 15 years, it was broken and I knew how to
Yeah.
fix stuff that's broken. But I'm
Yeah.
looking around going, I think we're fixed now. Everything seems fine now, but the numbers are not corresponding with what I've been
Yeah.
told they should. So I must be missing something somewhere. So this whole idea that the question of yours, how then he said we need to figure out how to understand health in ministry without numbers attached
Mhm.
to it, which of course is your question, and which is the right question for this because we're so used to the numbers. So when you're
Yeah.
looking at a healthy church, you need to look around at non-numerical things such as are people excited about showing up on Sunday? Two, when they show up, are they excited to bring their friends, or do they just show up and hang out with their own folks?
Yeah.
Are people being discipled and brought into leadership? So, for instance, in the first 15 years, even during the season of numerical growth,
Mhm.
if we needed something done on a full-time staff basis, we had to hire from the outside. Today, we could double our church today, and we wouldn't have to hire a single person from the outside
Wow.
because we've
Wow.
got people who have been discipled into these positions who could easily do it for full-time pay somewhere, and they choose to stay here. So,
Brilliant.
discipling people into maturity, discipling people into leadership. We look around, we realize we're sending people off to be paid to do ministry at other churches that
Yep.
we trained up over the last 3 years. And now other people are going to get the benefit of it because they've got the budget to be able to pay them, and we don't.
Yeah.
Our church started getting younger. Our demographic today is way younger than it was 31 years ago when I showed up.
Mhm.
So you've got an enthusiasm and an excitement for that. Our demographic mix matches the demographic mix of our community.
Beautiful.
Um,
Yeah.
we do outside the walls ministry constantly, from
Mm.
a home for abused women and children to the ministry that I do to overseeing the youth department for our denomination for Southern California. So there's all kinds of ways you can look around, and they'll be different. They'll be different in each church. Part of the challenge of assessing health non-numerically is
Yeah.
if you assess health numerically, then you can put out a template of percentages and go. We've discovered that in healthy churches, at least 40% of the congregation members attend a small group, and at least this percentage does this,
Yeah.
and at
Yeah.
least this percentage does this. So it's easy to look at the percentages and match them up with yours and go, okay, we need to bump this up a little bit. But if
Mhm.
you're doing it non numerically, there's no standard one answer. So for us, we send people off into ministry elsewhere, but another
Mhm.
healthy church might not be doing that regularly because what they do health wise is going to involve seniors
Yeah.
or something else, right? So there are certain things that people should be growing in their faith. We should look around and see that people are reading, that mature believers are reading the scripture and are discipling others. But there's a whole bunch of standards of health that are just different church to church. So that's part of the challenge of it.
That's wonderful. I can't wait. The second half of our time together, actually, just after a few more questions, we'll jump in a little bit more. So I'm really excited to pick and prod at some of that. So, how about this? Going back to your biography, I know that from having listened to some of your podcasts, you come from a history of pastors. But what about you? Like, when did you actually like have a moment either of surrender or the faith became your own? I know everybody's story is a little bit different, but when did Jesus become like Savior and Lord for you?
Well, I was about 6 years old, and I was in a kids. There was the adults were having their adult services. They had a guest speaker, and every night that week he was coming in, and they were doing services. So they had a kids minister who came in and did it was I remember clearly, it was a Christian magician where
Nice.
he'd put a black handkerchief in the cap and then bring out one that's red for the blood of Jesus and white for how he purifies
Beautiful.
us and that kind of a thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I was just watching this mesmerized, and I was 6 or 7, and I remember at a certain, and I was the preacher's kid, so my dad is the pastor of the church.
Mhm.
And at a certain point, at the end of it, he gave an invitation to salvation as he did every time. But one day, second or third day, he said, "Your parents might be Christians. They might be upstairs right now in the worship service. Your parents might even be the pastors of this church, but that doesn't mean you're a Christian."
Wow.
And I went, "Oh, oh, I got to do this for
Yeah,
myself." Like, to
that's
me,
good.
being a Christian was like being Irish. Your parents
Yeah,
are Irish, you're Irish, right? Uh,
yeah.
I realized, no, that's a decision I have to make. So I went, oh, okay. I guess I better take care of that right now.
That's awesome.
And
So good.
it's stuck ever since. So, and then what's weird is for years, I'm old enough now that this was back, in the 1960s when I gave my life to the Lord. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a whole lot of testimonies coming out from David Wilkerson crossing the switchblade and so on, where
Yeah,
gang members and coming out of Calvary Chapel and hippies and drug users.
yeah, yeah,
So there were tons of testimonies of ex gang members and ex drug
yeah,
users and so on who are coming to Christ and amazing stories. And that was the standard testimony. And
yeah.
I'm sitting there as like an 11-year-old teenager who's never had a drink, never picked up a cigarette, never wanted to. And I'm
Yeah,
thinking, like, am I going to have to live a life of depravity
yeah,
first
right.
before I didn't know what to do, right? I
Yeah,
was I was like really concerned. And then one of the guys who was 5, 6 years older than me had gone off to Bible college in our church, came back after a year of Bible college. My dad said, get up and give your testimony. So he did. And his testimony was, I was born and raised in this church. I've never wanted to do anything other than serve Jesus. And now I'm going to Bible
yeah.
college. And
So
I just
good.
want to testify about the sustaining and keeping power of God. And that if you raise your kids in a godly home and they get to
Yeah.
grow up without experiencing what so many of our friends here. And he looked around at friends and said, and he named them, the drugs that you went through and the alcohol that you went through and the gang
Mm,
experience you went through. I'm so grateful that you're here and that God delivered you out of them. But I've got to also say, I'm grateful that God kept
yeah.
me from all of that.
Yep.
And I went, okay, I can do that testimony. That's me.
That's good. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen many of friends too, who had similar testimony to yours and felt like, "Hey, I've gotta go do some bad stuff so that Jesus can save me."
It's
And
weird. I
so,
know.
yeah,
Yep.
I hear you. That's cool. What about this? So it sounds like, the magician played a role at that particular moment. It sounds like
Mhm.
you've got, the blessing of a family that has a structure kind of leading you toward
Yeah.
kingdom and Jesus-centric things. But who discipled you? Who mentored you? Whose imprint do you carry to this day?
My parents, um, as a preacher's kid, there tends to be one of two ways. Preachers' kids either tend to become preachers themselves or
Yep.
they end up being the rebel.
Yep.
Uh, and sometimes they're both combined, but the rebel preacher. But it tends to be one or the other. And growing up in a preacher's home and spending time with other preachers' kids, I remember very distinctly when I was, old enough to kind of pay attention to these kinds of things, as a early mid teenager, going to my friends' homes whose parents were pastors and walking into their house and experiencing something very different than I experienced in my house, and something very different than that pastor was talking about when he got up on stage and was preaching. And
Mm,
I saw the dichotomy between a presentation of holiness in the pulpit and not living that way at home,
yep.
being mean to their wives, just being absent from their family, and even worse.
Mm,
And I look back at my parents and went, they are who they are everywhere they go. They do not
yeah.
present one face in one place and a different
So
face in a
good.
different place. And I just watched that happen. And then I started paying attention to them, because some of it, as kids, we don't understand the value that our parents do until
Yep.
we become parents ourselves and we
Yep.
realize, wow, they worked really hard at this. But because of that, seeing my friends who were preachers' kids and seeing that get conflict at home, I started paying attention, and I started, these are people to pay attention to. I remember, I'll tell you one story very clearly.
Yeah.
It was mid 70s. I was a teenager. We were living in Toronto, Canada, And Toronto is one of the most multi-ethnic cities in the world, and it's one of the
Mm.
few multi-ethnic cities that has always been able to make it work somehow.
Hmm.
And my parents were heading home after church one day, and they were in the front seat talking, and I was in the back seat as a kid, and my sisters were arguing with each other, so I was just trying to pay attention to the peace in the front seat between my parents. And Dad was saying, so and so and so and so are engaged, and they're going to get married. And my mom was like, oh, okay. Have you talked to them about the race thing? And when she said it, I didn't know what it was until it hit me. Oh, he's black, she's white.
Yeah.
We had such a multiracial congregation. Race was not an immediate identifier for me, right? Because there was such a mix. And I went, oh, that's right, they are. And he said, what do you mean? She said, are you going to, I mean, what do you, because this was during the season where racial issues were huge on the streets of America. It was shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, all of that. And he said, what do you mean? They're good Christians. They love each other. They're called by God. I'm going to marry them. And she said, no, I just wanted to be sure. I agree with you. But, are you going to walk them through anything? He said, well, I'm going to walk them through that right now. That might be a challenge for them because some people are going to look down on that. But I've done a thorough, reading of scripture, and there ain't nothing in the Bible that says that's not right. So I'm not going to, if anybody's got any issues, they're going to have to talk to me. Basically, I'm going to run defense on them if anybody's got a problem with a black man marrying a white woman. And I'm sitting there as a young teenager in the back seat listening to that. Yeah. And those kinds of things form your character.
Yeah.
Right.
That's good.
So that's who I paid attention to. That and there's not even somebody else a close second to my mom and dad.
Oh, wow.
As far as discipling me. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Extraordinary people. And they're still alive and well today in their 80s and live just a few miles from us. And we see them at least once a week, and they continue to disciple me. Yeah.
Oh, what a blessing. That's so good. That's a rich inheritance.
Oh yeah, it really is.
Yeah. What about, so I'm assuming Dad had a smaller church too. So what about who mentored, discipled some of the small church stuff that you carry and then now live out?
Dad pastored mid-sized to large. What back then were very large churches, like church 600-700. Back in the era when 600 or 700 was often the largest church in a big city. So he and very like they were. I remember when I was 13 or 14. So we're talking 1973, 74. We had a missions conference. And they gave over $100,000 to missions in a single offering in 1973, 74, which is, I mean, that's like over $500,000 today in a congregation of 600-700 people. The percentage is just, the numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
And so he was very successful in that. He was always preaching for his friends. He was always asked to be on different boards here and there. And he was just in leadership. Everywhere he went, he was the guy in the room. And then I come into ministry, and I'm never the guy in the room. I was never asked to preach for somebody else. I was never asked to speak at a camp or at a conference.
Yeah.
And then I get to this church 30 years ago, and when I come to the church, there's a kid who's kind of overseeing the youth group, and he's kind of unofficially the youth pastor because the previous youth pastor had just left. So I thought, well, I guess this is the kid I have to work with. And we kept working together, and he became the official youth pastor. And he did that for over 25 years. He was the youth pastor of the church. And at about year 7, 8, or 9, if you're 7, 8, 9 years as a youth pastor in the same church, you're like the longest serving youth pastor in the entire state, kind of a thing. So he's going around, and he's preaching at youth conferences. He's going and he's teaching youth pastors around the country and around the world. And I'm sitting here in our small church just saying, well, I'll see you when you get home again. Nobody's asking me anything.
Oh, that's good.
I didn't even I've never written that. I've never put that anywhere because I don't want him to feel bad that somehow his success contributed to my feelings of inferiority, but that was actually a part of it. So all of this is going on. And here I live in Orange County, California. I live just 3 miles from Calvary Chapel. I mean, they just wrote a hit movie about a church near me. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Vineyard, Saddleback, all these churches are all around us, and they're all just going crazy. And I think it feels like every church in the world, especially every church near me, is just going crazy, except for me.
Yeah.
And so, I went through this meltdown that I told you about, and I looked around and I tried to find someone that like you're asking about, to
Hmm.
mentor me in the value of small churches, and I couldn't find anybody.
No one.
Like I said, if I'd been able to find my book, I wouldn't have written
Yeah.
my book. If I'd found a mentor, I probably would have just been mentored and been fine with that. I had to scrounge. I had to I had to look into my own experience and go, well, this worked and that worked. And let me talk to other small church pastors and see what works there and how that's,
Hmm.
oh, this is not just a me thing. This is a small church thing, because I'm talking to all my friends in small churches and we're all
Yeah.
experiencing this. So I just had to find it in bits and pieces wherever I could find it. And then I just started writing about it. And the moment I started writing about it, it exploded. I mean, I started getting requests to come and speak, to be on
Interesting. Yeah.
podcasts, to write books, to write articles,
Yeah.
because I was speaking into somebody said you're the only fish in a small, you're a big fish in a small
Yeah.
pond.
Yeah.
And I felt like the only fish in an empty pond. There
Yeah.
wasn't someone to mentor me in this. There simply wasn't.
Yeah.
So I had to learn from my own experience. I had to learn from what my parents had done. I had
Brilliant.
to scrounge whatever I could, little bits and pieces, and become a place where all these little bits and pieces became consolidated into a single message.
Wow. That's really good. Okay. One last question, kind of in this bio part. It'll probably cross over into where we're headed to.
Yeah.
So, to have faced those challenges, to have spent your 40 days, could have been 80, but you went with
Mhm.
40. You kept coming back. Where did that character fortitude come from to stick it out when there was nobody else and you're a lone pioneer?
I could credit myself with character and fortitude. I didn't know how else to earn money.
Yeah.
And there was a period of time where I'm
Yeah.
going to tell you that's what it was. I stayed in ministry because it was the only way I knew to put a paycheck in the bank to be able to put food on the table for my family. Um,
Yeah.
Now you can't do that for a long period of time, because that becomes all kinds of bad things.
It
But
does.
for
Yeah.
a
I've seen
season,
that.
for a season, it was just I gotta pay the bills. I got to put one foot in front of the other. And as I do this for a short period of time, I have to figure out what I'm going to do next. Am I going to stay with this, or am I going to
Hmm.
find some other way to earn a living? And because I went to counseling,
Mm,
and because the church was healthy, I have to give all credit to God
yeah.
and all thanks to my congregation, who God used, who held me up through that season, who never came to me and said, "Why are you leaving for 40 days? What's the matter with you? Why shouldn't we get another
Mm,
pastor? Maybe there's a
yeah.
better person who can do this." They they could not have been more supportive. There was never a negative word or a negative attitude or a negative look. It
Wow.
was all, how can we help you? How can we love you? How can we support you? What burdens can we remove from your shoulders?
Wow.
Yeah, everywhere, staff, board,
Wow.
congregation, not a single exception.
Yeah.
So
So good.
this is where my voice starts to crack, because I looked around and I saw that what I was experiencing should be normal,
Mm,
and it's not.
yeah.
When I tell that story, people react like you're reacting now, in
Hmm.
astonishment. And this shouldn't be astonishing.
Yeah. I
This
hear you.
shouldn't be surprising. We should, as Christians, be looking around and going, yeah, that's what we do. That's who we are. Uh, so they behaved normally. They behaved like normal Christians should behave on a normal
Yeah.
basis.
Um,
And it's exceptional. And they sustained me, my wife, my kids, my family, to get through to the other side. If it had been almost any other church that I know of,
yep.
I wouldn't be here talking to you today.
Yeah.
Um, Thanks be to God, and thank you for the people that He brought into my life, this extraordinary congregation that I continue to serve
Wow.
today.
How beautiful.
I'm beyond grateful.
Yeah, that's such a good testimony. Yeah, because I've watched pastors go through maybe similar dynamics like what you're facing. I don't know that they always have the health factor in the church that you're talking about. And I think I'm getting a little clearer on because that is another indicator of the health of the congregation that you were in, the way that the response happened there. But I'll watch a pastor go through a similar thing. I don't know what else to do. And I don't know that I've ever tried to articulate it, but it's like they settle in some way and then just become a product of whatever the machine is that operates at. And it's like they hit a lid and they're like, okay, I'm not going to get past it, and then they coast into retirement. And the church maybe is functioning, but it's not pushing toward greater health. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Happened a lot, and um, I think it's part. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it. On the pastoral side, one of the early lessons that I learned when I was my first preaching class in Bible college,
Hmm.
the teacher got up and said, "Never go to the Bible to find a text to preach on."
Mm.
And we all like,
Mm.
"What?" He said, "When you go and you open up that sacred book,
Hmm.
you go in to spend time in the presence of God and to hear from Him to speak to your own heart and to your own life. And if you do that regularly,
Mm.
and if you do that well, and if you do that relationally with Jesus, you will never have to find a text to preach on, because out
Yeah.
of the overflow, you will
Yeah.
bless people for the rest of your life." And I took that seriously, and I have done that. And so, because of so I have, even going through difficult seasons, I have maintained a healthy spiritual walk. My parents were the example of that. Then I got little notes like that along the way that said, "Oh, there's a little way to
Yeah.
to look at this and to do that well." So there was that, and then I taught that to the congregation, so they became healthy. And then even when we, so when we grew in numerically, they were grateful for it. But when we stopped growing numerically, they weren't panicked, because they looked around and went, "We still like this place. We still love it. There's still good stuff
So
going on."
good.
Even as
Yeah.
we're collapsing numerically, nobody's at each other's throats.
Yeah. Mm.
So when you're able to lay a foundation of that kind of health, and you're continuing to grow yourself, how many times have leaders said, "Your organization looks like you, your church looks like the pastor."
Yeah.
Okay, so pastor, if you want the church to look like you, and if you want the church to be there to support you, then when your associate pastor has a bad weekend, has a bad
Mhm.
Sunday, makes a couple mistakes, you know, uh, be a soft place to land, because at some point you're going to need a soft place to land
That's good.
yourself.
That's really good. Man, refreshing. Well, it's great to be able to hear. Well, let's turn a little bit more, and we'll just kind of unpack some of the things that you've already laid the stage for. My opening question, kind of as we get into like small churches, your emphasis and all that, I was going to say something like, where did this emphasis come from? But you've really already laid that on the table. We've kind of heard the inflection point, even from when you were beginning to be invited to speak as you wrote that first book. So where I was going to go from there, I'll tell you my second question, then you can tell me if there's anything you want to fill in that you
Okay.
feel like would be helpful for listeners. But I was going to say, well, let's go to definitions then, because I know that's
Mhm.
something that I've found really helpful as I've read your materials. Like, okay, this is great. You get into definitions. What's a small church? Here's a house church. Here's a mega church. And you started laying that out. So that's
Yeah.
where I'd love to go. But do you feel like there's anything else biography wise that leads to like your emphasis in small church that's missing?
No, I've talked about me enough.
Okay,
But
that's
yeah,
good.
no, that is a hugely important question. And I defined small one way in the grasshopper
Mhm.
myth that I wrote 11 years ago. And I really kind of got that from some of the standard numbers that are out there. And then in Small Church Essentials, I define small slightly differently than that. And today I've got a slightly better definition than that. So my definition changes about every 5 years, which means 5 years from now I'll have a better one than this, but
Yeah,
this is my
that's
best
good.
one so far.
Yeah.
So today, here's how I define small churches. There's a church of 50, give or take 50,
Mhm.
and there's a church of 150, give or take 150. We consider both of those to be small churches. Those are two very, very different types of small churches. Okay.
Yep.
So if you're pastoring a church of 50, give or take, and you just heard me say that a church of 150, give or take 50, also is small, which means a church of 200 I consider small. That may be bigger than the biggest church in your town. I get it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are very distinct differences between pastoring a church of 50, give or take, and 150, give or take. I know that because I've pastored both.
Good.
But as many differences as there are, there are more similarities between them than there are differences.
Okay.
The big difference shift happens after what church growth folks like to call the 200 barrier. I don't like using
Hmm.
the term barrier because it implies that there's something wrong,
Yeah.
but there's not. But and the difference for me is this: it's God knows everyone and is everywhere, and we're not Him.
Hmm.
So we have limits to our capacity.
Yeah.
So I draw this based not on the number of churches that are out there or anything, or the size of the town that you're in. I draw these lines based on pastoral capacity because I'm talking to and working with and resourcing and encouraging pastors.
Yeah.
So at a church of 50, give or take 50, the pastor can know everyone and
Yep.
be at pretty much every event. So there is constant pastoral presence and relationship.
Yep.
At 150, give or take, the pastor can know all of the regulars and can be at all of the main events. So there's still pretty consistent pastoral presence and pastoral relationship.
Yeah.
But above 200, even starting at about 150, but definitely above 200, we are beyond our capacity to be at all or most of the things or know all or most of the people. And that's when we start having to hand off our hands-on pastoral duties to other people.
Yeah.
So that's where the big shift takes place. I believe one of the reasons why most of the churches in the world are small, and like 90% of the churches in the world are under 200.
Hmm.
When people make that statement, 90% of the churches in the world are under 200. Most people who make that statement make it as a presumed negative. I do
Correct.
not
Yeah.
presume that as negative. That's just simply what the demographics are. I believe that part of the reason 90% of churches are under 200 is not because 90% of my peers in ministry are stupid. It's because most pastors are called to do hands on small church type
Yep.
pastoral work. Most pastors, when they think about pastoring, they think about preaching on Sunday, visiting people in the hospital, being there for baptisms and
Yeah.
and those kinds of things. And they think of the small church type stuff. Very few pastors feel called to big church type activities like coordinating a staff and raising funds and setting up a
Yeah.
multi-site. That is a skill set that I value, that I'm grateful for, but that very few people have the calling to or the skill set for.
Yeah.
Most of our skill sets match the small environment. It's not a lesser skill set. Being a hands-on pastor is not a lesser skill set than being a
Yeah.
managing pastor.
Yeah.
But that's where most of us are called to.
Man, that's so good. I love it because this is refreshing. So many voices around us, like in your own story, are there telling us how we're not succeeding, we're not doing it correctly, and you are just breathing a ton of life into so many people at this point. Let's see. The culture, though, does seem to like point toward these celebrity pastors. It's almost like celebrity is the goal, and celebrity pastors have a large following. You know, they are getting invited in all of those places, and so it feels like there is a push for celebrity in there. What do you say to a pastor who is in the situation you were, is dealing with 50 plus or minus, like you had talked about, knows these
Yeah.
people really well? What do you say to a pastor? Because that celebrity voice, whether it's coming from the inside or from the culture or echoing, is still there. What do you say to that?
So what's the root word of celebrity? It's celebrate.
Yeah.
So a celebrity is one we celebrate.
Hmm.
I don't think that's what the Bible tells us to do in the
That's good.
church, to celebrate the pastor.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. Let's make Jesus famous.
Yeah.
Let's celebrate him. Let's not chase after that fame or celebrity ourselves. These these are um, these are dangerous tools. They're not necessarily negative, but they are highly volatile, very
That's good. I like
powerful,
that.
and very dangerous.
Hmm.
So, if in faithfully following Christ, he taps you and says, I want a big church here, and I want you to be the one who does it. And it just naturally happens as you're being faithful to
Mhm.
Christ. Great. Awesome.
Yeah, that's good.
But even then, be careful with it. The bigger the platform, the bigger the spotlight, the bigger the
Yep.
danger. Both from what others will perceive you, the bigger conflict. All of a sudden, every time you make a slip of the lip, you're going to have people
Yeah.
online who are going
Yeah.
to do the breakdown of every single word and what it actually means, right? And
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
I have become so grateful that I don't have that spotlight, because having to deal with all that
Yeah.
would just drive me out of my mind. So yeah, we want to celebrate Jesus. We want to make him famous and not ourselves. And the moment I become a celebrity, then there is even if I'm not intending to, even if did happen in a natural way, part of the danger is how then now do I continue to shift the spotlight off of me and back onto Jesus? Because you
Mhm.
can't have two spotlights in two places. You cannot love the one and
Mm.
to serve the one and love the other, right?
That's
You
good.
cannot serve God and mammon. And mammon in that passage is not just money. Mammon is actually, real quick, but in that
Mhm.
passage where God and mammon, some of the newer translations just say you can't serve God and money. But
Yeah.
mammon is actually not a Greek word, which is what most of the rest of the New Testament. It's actually an Aramaic word that the
Mhm.
translators kept in place. So they're writing everything. They're taking Jesus, who spoke Aramaic. Luke and John and the others are all writing all of Jesus' Aramaic spoken words and writing them out in Greek,
Yep.
but they take a couple of them and they keep them in Aramaic. Now, why would they do that? Because this means something. And
Mhm.
mammon carries a special weight, and it means more than money. It means this pull towards other things. Mammon was actually the name of the god of
For
greed
God. Yeah.
for some Aramaic tribes. So you cannot serve God and mammon and fame and greed and money
Yeah.
and the pull towards status. They
Yeah.
they can't be done at the same time. So be careful.
That's really good. Yeah, because I've seen the trap of celebrity in a small church too, where, yeah, it's not just that I have a platform or that becoming even famous. I like your spotlight analogy that you can't have the two spotlights. And so the turning it back to Jesus is really good. How about one more, like another cultural issue that I notice in pastors facing, myself facing as I was leading a church, is not just celebrity. That's usually for the individual leading it and the pressures and things that go on there, but the consumer culture that we find ourselves in. Like it almost seems like the social contract that somebody coming into a church expects is, Pastor, you will feed me, I will consume the religious goods that you have. And then it's almost like we placate people to just be good consumers versus kingdom producers. That's a lot of my language. I'm not trying to force that in there, but speak to that as you think about this from that small church lens.
Fully agree. The celebrity culture puts the focus on the pastor. The
Mhm.
consumer culture puts the focus on the congregation member.
Yeah.
So if it's a consumer culture, then the consumer is king. Like consumer is king is literally a term that's used in the business world.
Yep.
The customer is king. Same thing.
Yep. Yep.
And if you got a consumer culture, you've just shifted the spotlight from the pastor to the congregation member. And the Bible speaks to that really, really clearly. It's the people who gather up teachers who say what their itching ears want to say. Right? That
Yeah.
passage is a definition of consumer culture.
That's good.
You know,
Yeah.
they're consuming from multiple different sources of people who say the things they want
Yeah.
to hear to confirm their biases, and they have a consumer basis. And we live in a very consumer oriented culture. Everybody is always pushing back against it, at least verbally, but in the meantime we're
Mhm.
demanding that our needs be met, so we're behaving
Yeah. Yep.
we're behaving exactly the same way of the thing that we say we're pushing back against. And yeah, we are not supposed to be consumers of religious goods that are presented by the pastor and the staff. That's actually part of what happened when we grew in that short period of time, very large, before we just collapsed again.
Mhm.
In assessing it later, why did we collapse? Part of what I realized was during that we had a 2-year season where we grew. We had grown over 15 years to a point of about 200, from 20 when I showed up to about 200 at
Okay.
about the 15-year point. And then in 2 years, we went from 200 to 400,
Okay.
like
Yep.
huge growth in a short period of time. and then it collapsed to under 100 in less than a year. So
Mm.
that's my success story.
Yeah.
Uh, and then since then we've had a steady, anyway. But in that time when we were going very quickly from 200 to 400, I look back now, we did not have any more baptisms than we did during the previous 2 decades.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't conversion growth, it was transfer growth. We were
Yeah.
entertaining bored Christians.
Yeah.
And we had elevated our Sunday morning religious stage show to a point where we
Mm-hmm.
started getting buzz, and we were the buzzy church for a while.
Yep.
And we were attracting people with the buzz. We were doing cool, we were doing cool video packages and cool dramatic presentations. We had a really kicking band. I had elevated my preaching because I wasn't hands-on, spending time with people anymore. So I had more time for sermon prep. So my sermons were getting
Mm-hmm.
better. But all of it was disconnecting from real people, and it was putting on just a better show. And
Mm-hmm.
I am grateful today that did not continue to go, because my that was I was allowing my spirit to become drained. You used the
Mm-hmm.
terms earlier when you were talking about your situation. You used the word machine and show.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
We became a machine with a great show.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize it at the time, because the numbers were, when you're going from 200 to 400 in 2 years. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that gets you, called to come to speak at a church growth
Yeah.
conference, but it's
Yep. I
pretty
hear you.
impressive numerical increase, right?
Yeah.
And it was heady. It was, oh, I'm really something now. This is finally kicking in. It's finally working.
Yep.
And I look back at my attitude during that time, and I'm grateful that the Lord did not allow that numerical increase to continue, because that list of pastors that we all have in our heads, who we look at and go, how did they crash like that? How did they do such stupid things when the Lord was blessing the church so much? We all know
Yeah.
what that list is, right? I'd have been one of the guys on that list if
Yep.
those numbers had continued to go up.
Yeah. Man,
I would have.
that's good.
I was
That's
heading.
really good. Yeah, maybe we could even have a separate call after this, because this is lining up with a lot of my story. I was on a team. We were the largest church in our region in Central California, in a really small town of 10,000. We were running 800 people.
Wow.
And so, we were the thing. It was a machine. There was a show, and it was a lot of fun. And but then as I stepped in to take the lead, a series of negative things kind of even led up to that point. But I would regularly say I have the honor of being the pastor to lead this church to the lowest average attendance in the last 20 years. And I think it really, I did that, I think, probably for my own self, to deal with that challenge. I wish I would have had somebody like with a refreshing voice like what you're bringing in my corner at that time. But we became healthier on the other side of that journey. But it was really hard, because there was a lot of death to ego, a lot of death to, I had the previous to compare it to. We're not that anymore. And I found that was regularly echoing inside of my own heart. So thanks. I really appreciate that. Okay, what about, I don't want this to be like a promo or to like steal the thunder, so to speak, for what you're going to be sharing at the upcoming conference, but what types of principles and practices beyond what you've already laid a foundation for will you be addressing at that conference?
What I'm going to be talking about is, we're going to spend some time talking about the differences between the way a small church is led and the way a big church is led. And it's not to pit one against the other. But most of us are not aware that big church leadership principles and small church leadership principles are very different, and sometimes they are 180-degree difference. Like it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
But what typically happens is we're taught by a big church, and we hear, oh, that works there, and we think, drop a 0 or 2, and we'll just do that here.
Yeah.
And it's not just a matter of numbers or scale. You're in a different environment. You're in a different circle. So there are some things that all churches have in common, of all sizes. They are my brothers and sisters in Christ in big churches. I have no problem with big churches whatsoever.
Yeah.
So there are some things we have in common. But there are a whole bunch of things about the way we pastor and lead churches that change over about size. And so we need to understand it. And by the time I'm able to walk through some of this very specific details about the differences between big and small, not only
Hmm.
will people who hear that then have an understanding of the differences between it and how to operate in a small church manner appropriate to
Hmm.
your size, but once you know the differences, you then will be able to listen to a big church podcast, read a book by a big church pastor, or go to a conference and hear a big church pastor teach, and you'll know how to filter what
I
they
like that.
say
Yeah.
and take, oh, that doesn't work here, that doesn't work here, but that I can use. Because I used to go to big church conferences and I'd come
Yeah.
home and I'd just try stuff because it worked.
Yeah.
And nobody told me, first of all, that some of that stuff won't apply to you. And secondly, how to know the difference between what would apply and what wouldn't apply. So we're going to give you a filter to help you
Good.
sort that out so that from after that, you'll actually be able to get more out of our friends in big churches than you currently can because you know how to filter it properly.
Well, I love that. That's really great. Really good. I'm excited to be able to hear that.
Yeah.
What about like as the conference kind of comes to a close, what would you hope a pastor or team would be able to take from it? Sounds like, I'm already experiencing just having conversation with you, like encouragement, refreshment versus like kind of a sense of condemnation or, even if it's coming from inside, just the idea that like, okay, like, no, this is the right direction to go. But what else would you hope that a pastor leader would take away from that conference?
And when I first started this ministry, I had three goals, and these are the three goals that I hope you'll take away from the conference. Anybody who
Hmm.
comes, number one, you mentioned already encouragement. I want you to
Hmm.
leave encouraged, to know that small is valuable, that pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong,
Ooh, I like that.
right? That small is not a problem to fix; it's part of a strategy that God is using.
Beautiful.
So be encouraged in that.
Hmm.
Secondly, we're going to give you resources that will help you go, oh, okay, that's how this works in a small church. I've been taught this from a big church standpoint, and they're not wrong, and I'm not stupid. We're just in different circles.
That's good. Yep.
Okay, so you'll leave encouraged. Secondly, you'll leave resourced with things that are small church specific. So those were the first two goals that I have for this
Hmm.
ministry. I want to encourage small church pastors. Two, I want to resource them, and three, my third goal was that I wanted to be able to bridge the gap between big and small. Uh,
Mm.
my my I want to be able to mainstream these small church ideas into the broader church leadership world. And so if you are in a big church or if you are a leader over other churches, don't look at this and think this is just for small church pastors. I'll stay home for this one. No,
Yeah.
you're going to go home with a
Good.
clearer understanding of your fellow ministers, your fellow partners in ministry in small churches. You will be better equipped to help them. One of the things I love about big churches and big church pastors is they are extraordinarily generous with what they
Yep.
learn. So if a big church
Yeah.
figures out a better way to do a thing, they broadcast it to everybody as quickly as they can. They want everybody to know, hey, we figured out how to do this
Yeah.
better. Let me show you this, rather than keeping it, trademarking it, and keeping it to myself. There's an extraordinary generosity among my big church pastor friends. But so if that's where you are and you're in a bigger church or you're a denominational leader or you're leading other churches in any other way, this will help you know the language to use and how to help your small church pastors in a way that you
Good.
might not see, but you got to hear it from a small church perspective. Some of it even is language. Within my own denomination, when I first started doing this, I sat down with my local denominational leader after he had
Hmm.
read my book. He actually called me in and he said, "Okay, can you walk me through some of this? Because I'm now realizing I'm using language that I thought was helping small church pastors,
Yep.
but I'm being condescending to them unintentionally."
Yeah. That's
So let's
good.
walk through some of that. And he's changed his
Awesome.
language so that he's more helpful and less condescending. He always wanted to be helpful, but
Hmm.
sometimes it's not enough just to have the desire. You got to have the right tools. So
Yeah.
we want to do that as well.
That's really good. All right. Well, kind of wrapping things up. Here's my final question. I'll give you a spot for just any final thoughts that you've got. But I know that you just recently finished a sabbatical. Again, I was listening to your podcast
Yeah.
that way. And one of the things you said as you got to the end that there were some just new insights that the Lord had brought to you during that time frame. I'd love to just maybe hear one or two of those things, especially now having heard your story of what led to, the things that you give voice to. What are some of the new angles the Lord's leading you in?
Well, the first thing that just hits me as you're saying that is one of the things I discovered that was really a delight was every once in a while I'll hear people met me, and usually it'll be on social media. Well, there's just no good churches around anymore. I can't find a good church near where we are. Well, you're not paying attention.
Ah, that's
We
good.
went to, we were off for 8 Sundays. We went to 8 churches, and 7 of them I would go back to and I would recommend to others in a heartbeat. And I
Yeah.
live, in this godless wasteland of California, right? That apparently has no good churches left anymore.
Yeah.
Nonsense. Either you're too picky or you're not looking closely enough.
That's good.
There are a lot of great churches out there. So that was a huge thing. Secondly, taking time away is hard. I had to
Mm,
do like 50% more work for several months in order to get ahead of things, in order
yeah.
to be able to take the time off that I took off. So it's not without cost. There is
Yeah.
serious cost just to get ready to walk. And I did a 50-day sabbatical, which just like my 40 days several years ago, which wasn't a sabbatical, it was a collapse. This was a chosen sabbatical that I did
Yeah.
intentionally and wasn't out of crisis at all. It should have been minimum of 100 days. Because what I learned was
Mhm.
the amount of time that it takes for pastors who are constantly in our own heads all the time, the amount of time it takes for me to mentally and emotionally actually be on sabbatical was right about the time where I needed to start to gear up to come out of sabbatical.
Interesting. Yeah. So you like missed the curve. Yeah.
So I got the flow in, I got the flow out, and I didn't get a big chunk of time in the middle to actually
Yeah.
be on it. Now,
Yeah.
I'm grateful I did the 50. It's better than not doing any. Okay. So I learned that. And then another thing out of it is I know that I'm talking to an audience, and 90% of you will never be able to take a sabbatical. 50
Mm.
days is
Yeah.
way outside the realm of possibility for you. And part of the reason I can do it now is because I'm not pastoring anymore. My youth pastor became my pastor. He's now covering the stuff at the
Yeah.
church, and the stuff that I do when I'm traveling around. I just simply didn't book, meetings during that period of
Yeah.
time. So I'm in a totally different place. Pastoring 20 years ago when I was pastoring a small church, there's no way I could have taken 50 days off on sabbatical. The reason I didn't do it is because I couldn't.
Yeah.
So, but here's the deal. This is what I learned. One of the things I learned. I'll give this to you as the last one for this for now.
Mhm.
Sabbatical is helpful, but it's not a command. Sabbath is a command.
Ooh, come on.
And
Come on. That's good.
but we have to Sabbath. In
Yeah.
fact, about a year or so ago, I did a message, and part of it was on Sabbath and on the
Yeah.
importance of Sabbath, the command of Sabbath, the necessity of it, and that God gave it to you as a gift. Open up the gift, people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And at the end of it, one of the young pastors that we're training came up to me with another young pastor who he is mentoring, and walked up to me. And the older of the two said, "Pastor, when is your Sabbath?" And I said, "It's typically Saturday, but occasionally it's Monday." And he looked at the younger minister in training that he was training and said, "See, told you." And I went, "Told him what? What's this about?" He said, this young minister in training said, "Well, when does pastor, but the pastor
Yeah.
Karl doesn't Sabbath. He's working on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this isn't a Sabbath. So he's not getting a Sabbath. And he's telling us we all ought to Sabbath." And he
Yeah.
said, "I guarantee you, if we ask pastor, he will tell us that his Sabbath is a different day than Sunday."
Yep.
So I
Yeah.
said, "Well, let's go." So I passed the test.
That's good. Yeah. That's
Right. But
good.
these two young ministers in training, now one who'd been around longer, knew me well enough and knew my character and
Yeah.
my schedule well enough to know I know this guy. He's not going to say it if he doesn't mean it. The younger one who didn't know me well enough to know has now heard, "Oh, yeah, okay. Sunday's not a Sabbath because Sunday's a work day. We have to take a different day." And to me, Sabbath has to have two elements biblically of its Sabbath. It has to have worship and it has to have rest. and
Good.
pretty much
Yeah.
nothing other than that. If you do anything other than worship or rest, it's not Sabbath. But if you don't
Mm,
do one if you don't do both, it's not Sabbath. A day of just rest is not Sabbath because there's no worship. And a day of just worship, which is Sunday for me, but it's work,
yeah.
is not Sabbath because it's not rest.
Yeah.
So you need one day out of 7 for worship and for rest. And that's not a suggestion, that's a command. And it's a necessity for a simply balanced emotional and family and relational and spiritual life.
Yeah. That's good. That's great. Well, thanks for sharing from the overflow of that recent time frame. That's good. Any other closing thoughts before we wrap this call up?
No, I am just so grateful for the opportunity. I love pastors. I am profoundly grateful for the people who have spoken into my life as pastors. I know where pastors are. I understand the challenges of it. And anytime I get to speak to a group of pastors to be able to lighten your load a little bit, and maybe leave a little more prepared for the task
That's
ahead,
good.
I'm grateful for the chance to do that. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for those of you that have been listening. I hope this is an encouragement for you if you haven't gotten registered. Be a part of that upcoming conference. Karl, thanks so much for joining here. Again, thanks everybody for being a part of the Awakening series.